Hello and welcome to Mary Shelley's Fears. In the next few minutes we are going to do a brief journey into an interpretation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We are going to focus on an extract of chapter number 5 and we will talk about some impressions upon a first reading of the text, how the historical context of the movement is reflected in the text, and the life and thoughts of Mary Shelley. Let's go! First, let us talk about our impressions at the first reading. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. It was already 1 a.m, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wreck whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? Thanks to this paragraph, in the first reading of the text, we can see how a gloomy and horrifying atmosphere is described by Dr. Frankenstein, who is filled with anxiety during his creature birth. Also, death is palpable in the environment thanks to some constructions such as the dull yellow eye, the candle nearly burnt out, and the glimmer of the half-extinguished light. Furthermore, Frankenstein continues describing his monster in such a realistic way that the reader doesn't have the impression of being in front of a supernatural creature. We can see how the beauty and the ugly come together in the monster's appearance, and we can nearly imagine it in front of us. The constant death epithets and the creepy atmosphere were the two main aspects which most surprised us during the reading of the excerpt. In addition, we have to admit that we already had a preconceived idea of the novel due to the Frankenstein horror films and other readings we had done on the subject before. We could do a deeper reading taking into account the context. It's necessary to understand the historical and artistic context of the Gothic movement in order to improve on the interpretation of the excerpt. We are going to mention some of the main characteristics of the Gothic revival. The reaction to rationalism as a metaphor of the forbidden soul of humans. Give wings to the mystery, the secrets, and the wild prohibited passions is a must on the Gothic texts. Frankenstein is a clear example of the topic, since the idea of giving life to a lifeless thing is unthinkable by the human judgment. Moreover, the story was actually inspired by one of the author's dreams. Secondly, as a reaction to the idyllic romantic landscapes, nature runs wild to its most dangerous extents. Therefore, Gothic also can be seen as a response to Romanticism or as an extreme version of its features. This way, nature is personified as a human being thanks to the pathetic fallacy. We can see how something terrible is going to happen, and nature mirrors this intensity of emotions. That means that we can see the psychological situation of the character of the story through the external appearance of nature. In conclusion, the Gothic literature brings together horrifying things, a wild landscape, and human emotions, usually the black side of them. As we can see, all these elements converge in Frankenstein. The fact of giving birth to a lifeless creature is out of human rationality and horrifies the reader. Also, the rain pattering against the panes is a reflection of Dr. Frankenstein's internal mood. Finally, we want to focus on the writer's life and her thoughts because we think that understanding her own experiences and points of view is essential to do an accurate interpretation of the text. One of the main aspects of the novel, as well as of Shelley's life, is her experience with death. Her biography stands out for being intertwined with calamity and death. Her mother died when she was only 11. Her sister and the first wife of Percy Shelley committed suicide, and only one of her 5 children survived into adulthood. A woman whose profession was writing in the late 18th century wasn't a common reality, but Mary Shelley is known for being an intellectual woman. In fact, she's one of the first women writers in the English literature. Virginia Woolf made a speech in 1931 called Professions for Women. She said in that, when she came to write, there were almost no material obstacles in her way, and the family peace was not broken by the scratching of a pen. But she said that this was thanks to the women who had cut the road many years before, like Jane Austen. Shelley was also one of these women who cut the road. Pride and Prejudice was written in 1813, and Frankenstein in 1818. Although she was an intellectual woman who enjoyed the conditions that other women of her time did not have, she was aware of the ideology of the proper lady and she attained to it. As Mary Povey says in her book The Proper Lady and the Woman Writer, Shelley's character was a combination between the stereotypical feminine reticence and an unconventional self-assertion. In other words, that is, that she accepted the unconventional wisdom especially pertinent to female education. Mary Shelley considered writing to be less a vehicle of urging her audience to criticize convention than a means of covering over whatever psychological complexities might challenge conventional property. Linked to this question, we have to introduce one of the main topics of Frankenstein and also of Shelley's life. What happens when you challenge beyond the established limits? As Victor Frankenstein does, Mary Shelley trespassed the usual limits of her time by being a woman writer who was pregnant. This way, giving birth was one of her central terrors. As she was not a normal kind of woman, because she was a writer, Shelley had fears of giving birth to a son that would be a monster, or the fact that she could be a mother monster without taking enough care of her child. Moreover, during the time she was writing the novel, she had a terrible nightmare where she envisioned a terrifying birth of her son. What most surprised us was the fact that this nightmare was very similar to the novel's excerpt we have read. As we can see, Mary Shelley had an enormous sense of guilt due to her situation. Our interpretation is that her fears are represented in her novel, and her anxieties around her life as a woman are reflected in the personality of Victor Frankenstein. In conclusion, we could say that Frankenstein is an alter ego of Mary Shelley, a character whose fears and actions have a parallelism in the author's life.